we'll go ahead and get started slowly. But I want to welcome everyone who could join us here today. I'm excited to have you here to see and I love seeing how the real estate community is coming together to navigate these uncharted waters and really, coming together to discuss and figure it out, and understand the impact. And that's what we're going to explore today. So just a couple of housekeeping items as we're getting started. For any technical difficulties, please drop your questions or request for assistance into the chat feature. And then if you have questions, please submit them in the Q&A tool. We do have someone who's monitoring the chat for technical issues, but if they see Q&A come in through the chat, they may redirect you to drop it in the Q&A, and we'll be watching the Q&A. We'll get through the material first, and then we'll go to the Q&A tool in the latter half of this to cover questions and address as many as we can, understanding we likely won't get to them all, but we're going to do our very best. And we'll talk a little bit later about other ways you can follow us, find out information. We'll be learning along with you, and we'll be sharing information as time goes on. So my name is Tina Lapp. I'm head of customer experience and instruction for Colibri Real Estate. We represent several real estate brands nationally for education. Today, we're delivering this webinar to our students through our brands on the western part of the country. So we have Allied Schools, Rockwell Institute, Key Realty School, Arizona School of Real Estate and Business, and Hogan School of Real Estate. So many of you on the webinar today likely either went to school with those brands or looking at classes there, or partner with us to help support bringing on new talent at your real estate organization. So we welcome you all. I'm here with a couple of my colleagues, Corinne Hamlin and John Wenner, and we're going to explore the recent NAR settlement and what it means to you and what we may expect coming down the pike. So I'd like to have them take a moment to introduce themselves. So Corinne, let's start with you.
Thanks, Tina. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. Again, Corinne Hamlin. My title at Colibri is Product Manager, and I focus on Colibri's and Rockwell's and Allied's and Keys and ASREB's pre-licensed products particularly. So I am spending all of my time thinking about prospective students and all of you who are in a pre-licensing course now. So my background, I have been around the real estate business for most of my life. When I was growing up, my family had a small real estate business. I think it must have just been an inevitability that I would end up here, but I have a deep love for the business. I did spend some time selling, but the majority of my now 20 years in the business has been spent in real estate education. I was an ed manager for a local realtor association, and then I was in education and licensing with my state's regulatory agency. So love talking about the real estate brokerage business. It is near and dear to my heart. Glad to be with you today.
Thank you so much, Corinne. And we're so glad to have you on here. You have such extensive knowledge in the real estate and education space. So we're fortunate to have you here talking about this with us. John, will you tell them a little bit about your background?
Thank you, Tina, very much. And welcome, everybody. And thank you for joining us today. I, too, like Corinne, have been around this business a long time, actually 30 years this year in real estate. I have California license and an Arizona license, where in Arizona as a manager broker, 712 agents, 12 offices as a part of that. And then I ran brokerage also, 212 agents in Santa Barbara. So having both, states of Arizona and California, a lot of years of experience as a manager broker, but also still as an active agent, and take a little bit of sales. But my role with Colibri is as the senior education manager, and I handle all of the instructors across the country and all of our brands. So pretty involved with all of the instruction for both pre-licensing and also for continuing education as to help the instructors. Excited to be here. This is a subject matter that it's been getting a lot of questions, especially in classes. So we wanted to be able to just kind of help out a little bit, and we'll try to answer what we can today. So Tina, thank you very much. Appreciate being here today.
That's fabulous. Thank you, John. And both of you, with your extensive knowledge, I'm sure this is no surprise that we have you here to discuss this pretty heavy and highly talked about topic that we're seeing in news channels across the US. There's a lot of discussion, both within the real estate industry and just out there with consumers. So here at Colibri, and across our education brands, we feel it's our responsibility to keep you up to date and supported through these unprecedented changes, to come together, to think through this and plan for the future. It's kind of an exciting time, but there are a lot of questions out there. So attendees on this webinar today consist of seasoned agents and brokers, as well as individuals just beginning their journey or exploring real estate for the first time and looking into getting into the profession. So, of course, a lot of questions out there. So we're going to start at the beginning. Corinne, why don't we start with you? And could you, with your background working for a realtor organization, can you kick us off by sharing, for those who may not be entrenched in real estate just yet, what is the National Association of Realtors, or NAR, and walk us through why agents join the association?
Sure. Thanks, Tina. I'll be happy to. So the National Association of Realtors, or NAR, is a trade association for folks in the real estate brokerage industry. I think often one of maybe the most misunderstood terms in our industry is the term realtor, because I hear that, I'm sure you've heard it too, that's sort of thrown around like that's just a licensee. Realtor is a trademarked term, actually, and it means a very specific thing, and that is that someone is a member of the trade association. So you may be thinking to yourself, wait a minute, that means that just because I hold a real estate license, I am not automatically a realtor, and that is correct. You can hold a real estate license, be a real estate agent, a real estate broker, depending on your state, and not be a part of the realtor organization, and therefore not be a realtor. But then the second part of the question then is why? Why do people join the association? How do they do that? The National Association, actually, to join the National Association, a licensee joins a local and state association. So in your area, there would be a city or a county-based or a regional-based association. You become a member of that organization, and by nature of your membership, also become a member of the state association and the National Association, and therefore take on that term realtor as a member. And the National Association of Realtors at the national, state, and local level have always offered quite a number of services. The things that you've probably heard of right off the top of my head are the education programs. So lots of certifications and designations through the Realtor organization. One that you're hearing about a lot right now is ABR, or the Accredited Buyer Representative Program, but there are lots of specializations. A lot of advocacy politically through the trade association. But probably one of the biggest driving forces for membership has been the multiple listing services, or MLSs. And that really is where we're going to focus today, because with this settlement proposal that we are going to be talking about, one of the big impacts is going to be in the MLS systems. Not in all cases, but in the majority of cases, in order to be a member of an MLS or multiple listing service, you also have to be a realtor member. And an MLS is a database of properties for sale and sometimes for rent in a local area. Now, I know that we have a lot of folks who may be joining us from the state of Washington, and the Northwest MLS, which is a very popular and widely used MLS, is an exception to this rule. That is not a realtor-owned MLS system. But with the majority of MLS systems, particularly that are realtor-owned, there is a built-in compensation arrangement which says, if I, as a listing agent, input a listing, I have the opportunity to make an offer of compensation to buyer's agents. And I'll leave it there and we'll get into the details of that, but to give you the overview of the organization and really who we're talking about. Thanks, Tina.
Yes, that's perfect, Corinne. So that kind of leads the way down to the next question. John, can you share a little bit about the history of why the seller has paid the buyer side commission and kind of where that's come from and what that really means?
Thank you, Tina. I sure will. For a lot of years, long before I even became as a licensee and a realtor, there was always this thing that the seller was the one that's going to be compensating licensees inside of a transaction. And that we used to call it just a seller's agent. And then you, as a buyer's agent, you kind of got part of that compensation. Well, of course, as what Corinne was saying, with the multiple listing becoming more sophisticated, and then in 1993 going into 1994, it came out with this thing called a buyer brokerage and buyer agency representation, because part of that time, buyers really didn't have representation, even though an agent helped them in selecting properties. There was always part of that seller. So that's where that seller thing always came from. As buyer's agency has evolved, though, we saw in the multiple listing that a buyer's agent could go in there, find a piece of property, and the listing agent would say, hey, we're willing to share our compensation with that buyer's agent. Well, that meant then that the buyer's agent didn't need any compensation agreement signed. Now, there are some states where that is different because the state law says you must have that. A lot of states don't. And when we think about buyer compensation, it literally flowed from the listing agent. This lawsuit, that's where it's stemming from, because of things that agents would say, and then the way the sellers felt that they didn't have any say hardly at all in the compensation to the buyer. And now we've got a lawsuit that's been going on. And of course, you've heard of the settlement coming in. But that was a real quick overview of the history of how buyer compensation comes to play.
That's great, John. Thank you. So as you alluded to, we've been hearing everywhere in the news and certainly in real estate specific channels about this NAR settlement. Corinne, can you explain what this settlement is all about and what the current status is?
Sure. Yeah, I'll be glad to. Thanks, Tina. So building on what John was telling you, the idea that listing agents were making and are making currently offers of compensation to buyer's agents. There are a number of sellers and homeowners who filed the lawsuit saying they did not feel they had any opportunity to negotiate that amount. They were forced to pay the buyer compensation, and the lawsuit has been in place. So the settlement proposal, and I am going to continue to say settlement proposal because this is not yet a done deal. NAR, the National Association of Realtors, has suggested this as a settlement offering, but this proposal still has to be approved by the courts. If in fact that happens, and it will probably be a month or two at least before we know that, if in fact the courts approve the settlement, then there are really three key areas. One is NAR has agreed to pay restitution of $418 million. Secondly, going back to what John was telling you, any Realtor member, and again, remember that these are the folks who are members of the organization, not necessarily every licensee in a state, but anyone who is a Realtor member would be required to execute a written buyer agency agreement with a buyer before offering any services. And part of that buyer agency agreement would be a conversation as to how the buyer's agent would be compensated. So that's number two. Number three is that in any MLS system, particularly realtor-owned or realtor-affiliated MLS systems, all of those offers of compensation that are being posted there in those systems have to go away. Doesn't necessarily mean that owners and listing brokers and buyers and buyer agents can't get together and negotiate some compensation from one side to the other. That certainly can still happen, but those types of offers cannot be posted in the MLS. So that is the proposal that NAR has laid on the table with those three key issues. What I will also say is that, again, as John said, in some states, there is already a regulatory agency requirement for every licensee to execute a buyer agency agreement prior to offering services. That is not true in all states. It's really about half and half. So in about half of the states, it isn't going to be anything different for a realtor member to have to execute a buyer agency agreement. But in states where that is not a requirement, that may be a key difference between a realtor member representing a buyer and a licensee who is not a realtor member.
If I may just, I'm going to expand just a little bit on, as Corinne was talking about the multiple listing and the settlement, what we saw happening, and I know as a broker, this is what I'd say to my agents. When you showed a property as a buyer's agent, the moment that you showed and you're getting ready to write the offer, you would take a snapshot of the multiple listing on that offer of compensation, and it freezes it. It froze it, which meant that if you did write that offer and the offer was accepted and you successfully closed, then the buyer's brokerage and that licensee involved in the transaction got a compensation. And it was frozen, whatever that was. And that's what Corinne was referencing, that the sellers felt like that they didn't have a way to negotiate with the buyer side because they had already negotiated with the seller. So once that was frozen, and it was kind of written in the multiple listing rules and regulations, and again, not all, but mostly. And that's the portion that's been causing a problem with sellers. And so that's why the lawsuit came out and trying to say, no, we need to have this, because commissions have always been negotiable. It's always been negotiable. The federal law for saying that a commission is standard violates federal law. And so we've always had that, always been there as long as I've been, 30 years. But the sellers couldn't negotiate something, so that compensation was locked in. So just a little clarification on that one too, or adding to it. But thank you, Corinne, for all of that.
Yeah, I think that's perfect, John. And while we're down that path, can you talk a little bit about how you see this settlement potentially affecting average earnings for agents going forward?
Thank you, Tina. And that's probably been one of the biggest questions we're seeing in classes right now, from licensees to candidates wanting to get their license. What's it going to do to my compensation? First and foremost, I go back to Corinne's comment. This is a private settlement between the Department of Justice, federal government, and the National Association of Realtors. So it doesn't impact any state laws. That's a policy. The MLS, the multiple listing rules and the guides that we have in there, that's what's going to change. So which means, like right now, I have a current listing and a buyer's agent wants to be compensated. They need to call me. That's going to be what the proposal is in the settlement from the National Association of Realtors, that there won't be anything in the multiple listing about compensation, which means they have to, the buyer's agent is going to have to contact the listing agent and ask, are you and your sellers offering compensation? And what is it? So before, we didn't have to do that in the MLS because it was printed. Now, if the settlement is resolved, as Corinne mentioned, because we don't know if it is going to be yet or not, sounds it's heading that way. They're going to have to ask. And then if it's not what they want, they'll have to negotiate it to try to go back and forth before the contract is written. And or if there's a way that we can write it into contract. So there's different ways that could be of handling it, just not like it was in the past by just going into multiple listing and say, oh yeah, I got this commission and it's coming. That's probably the biggest change, Tina, because we're going to have to ask as a buyer's agent, is there compensation from the seller? Yes or no?
Mm-hmm.
And then what is it? Which right now we haven't had to do. So it's going to add a step. It's going to add a step on the buyer's agent's case.
Okay.
And you know, Tina, I had the listings in Arizona. And so I've already had agents calling me because their broker, that's up to their broker, is asking them to start this kind of a process. So I've already had calls from agents saying, is your seller willing to offer compensation? And my answer was yes. That's the biggest change we're going to see, especially if this comes out where it's been accepted by the Department of Justice and through the courts.
I think I might just jump in there.
Yeah.
Thank you. And thank you, John. In addition to that, yes, what John says is so true. There is going to be a lot more, and this is always a good thing. More communication, in my opinion, is always a positive. So a lot more communication between the buyer's agent and the listing agent. But also very important is a more detailed conversation between the buyer's agent and the buyer client in advance of providing services. I know that there are a lot of questions around, well, how do I have that conversation? And that will be part of executing that written agency agreement with the buyer up front to say, hey, here are all of the great things that I do for you as a buyer's agent, and here's how here's the compensation that I or my company expects, and here are the different ways that we are going to try to get that compensation.
And that's very true, Corean, because right now, as a listing agent, because I mean, I've always been, and not so much anymore, but as a heavy listing agent, I got a compensation. The listing agreement is a compensation agreement, and it said what I was going to make as commission compensation. We never really had to worry about it doing with buyers because of the MLS. Well, if it's not going to be in the MLS, that might mean then the buyer's agent has to do a buyer compensation agreement with their buyer to get the compensation. So that will be a change. That will definitely be a change. Corinne, you mentioned the accredited buyer representation agreement training that we've had all these years. I know because I teach it for NAR. I'm an ABR instructor. And we always would say in the class, ABR, I mean, for years, a buyer should have a buyer compensation agreement in place already. Ironic as it was, the buyer compensation agreement in Arizona said if I had one in place and if the seller was compensating, then that you can't get two, it would satisfy the agreement. And there was language into that buyer broker agreement that the seller could provide compensation. It's kind of always been there, but we didn't have to. This may create us having to have a lot more buyer broker agreements than what we've ever done.
Thank you, John. So, Corinne, all this being said, is it still worth getting a real estate license?
This is maybe my favorite question of our whole presentation, because as you heard me say in the beginning, I am really all about real estate brokers and agents. I believe in the value of representation, and I think it has never been more important than to get to have buyers and sellers well represented. So I'm saying yes, it is absolutely still worth getting a real estate license. Number one, so that you can still be in this position of helping a home buyer sell their property, helping someone find a home, effectively representing both of those parties. But the other thing, and I think that sometimes this, especially right now, this is not a focus, and it should be. A real estate license opens the door to many career paths. So I think that recently we have all been saying, well, how is, is there still going to be a need for a real estate agent in these sales transactions? 100% yes. But then in addition to that, there are all kinds of career paths that come out of getting a real estate license. Property management is one of those. I mean, certainly you can think of those, but everyone here, all of us as panelists, our real estate license led us to real estate education and to real estate regulation and to leadership in other organizations. Lots of opportunities around economic development. So the value of a real estate license, both for traditional sales and for all of these, for these other tasks, is not in any way diminished. That said, I think it is going to be even more critical to be able to provide solid representation. So in those traditional types of transactions, oh yes, get a real estate license. There's still value in it.
I definitely would agree. As an active agent for 30 years, I believe it's going to sharpen the skills of buyers agents. Just not all, because everybody's, they're very professional out there, but this one extra step is going to call. And I've been seeing some questions, Tina, going in and out of chat about this. The ability to make a commission doesn't go away. It's not going to go away. The commissions are still going to be there. Buyers and sellers are still going to want to move properties, purchase and sell, manage and rent. So it doesn't go away. How we focus on the compensation, it's going to change because the buyer's agent hasn't needed that in all states, right? I got to keep quantifying that because there are some states that do have, as Corinne said, that regulatory law that says you must have it. A lot of states don't. And the ones that don't, it's gonna create an agreement that's going to have to be done somehow. And if I may, Tina, this one question in the Q&A is really a good example of what we're talking about. Because this question that I'm seeing in the Q&A talked about representation during new builds when the seller is the builder. Most sellers as builders may not have put things in the multiple listing. And when you showed that property, a lot of the times you did a compensation agreement when you brought the buyer to the property. So it was never in the multiple listing. So we had to, so if we wanted, or we asked that builder, are you offering? Because there's some builders that don't offer compensation. And if they don't, then that's where the buyer broker agreement comes into play, because now your buyer will pay you through that agreement. So this is a really good example of the change that we're going to possibly see if this thing gets ratified by the judge and Department of Justice, that the agreements of compensation between the seller and the buyer, of course, and some of you are making comments about verbal. No. Verbal doesn't work in contracts for us, and it will be. And I know a lot of the brokers in Arizona will have documents that we'll use, and I'm sure that even with our forms, we'll see changes of language and so forth, and having, like we did with the buyer broker agreement, and having that capability. So, Tina, Corinne?
Yeah, that's great, John. So with this potential settlement coming down the pike, we've seen this, we're waiting to see if the courts accept it. Do you expect that there will be some state law changes, since this is a realtor change and not specifically a change to state law? Do you anticipate that happening?
I imagine that some states, I wouldn't be surprised if we see bills introduced, as some other states already have them in place, to help rectify some of the dilemmas that the questions that I see in the Q&A are bringing up. between the verbal and between, and so it would take away from that if the states did come in and say, hey, you have to have this compensation agreement in place before you start showing. That would make it really easy for everybody. If every state came in and did that, I don't see that happening. But some states could say, and there could be people out there that are, from their states as state representatives to say, I think we need to change something here. And it could very well happen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Your thought?
Yeah, I was going to ask Corinne to chime in because there is a difference between what the NAR requires and what the state requires. So, Corinne, I'd love your commentary on that.
Sure, happy to. And this, I mean, I know that we've had pre-licensed students across the country saying, oh my gosh, I'm in a pre-licensed course right now. Is this course going to prepare me now that things are changing? Well, so the first thing I would say is breathe, because nothing has changed yet. And even if this particular proposal, this settlement proposal is ratified, that isn't impacting as yet state laws or regulations. So remember that any pre-licensing course is going to be preparing you to get a license in that state based on the laws and rules that are in place. Once you get licensed, then you may choose to join the realtor organization, which is another level once you have been licensed. But the license exam that you will be taking will be based on the laws and rules that are in place. So has anything changed as yet? Absolutely not. Are we paying close attention? Of course. And it's important to keep our eyes on this settlement proposal. And then as we are paying close attention to whether or not there are states who are, that are beginning to consider changes based on how it plays out. I think it's very likely and possible that we will see some changes, but just know that those types of changes, when we're talking about rule and law changes in a state, that takes time to make that happen. That is a lengthy, generally multi-month process. So even if the settlement is approved and states start making having those discussions and considering rule changes, we're still a number of months away. So we're paying close attention. We will be responsive as changes happen if they are. The other thing to be aware of is, there could be other implications that, that just because right now we're talking about compensation coming out of the MLS or an agency agreement requirement with a buyer, that it may not be just those issues. A state may decide, hey, and while we're talking about an agency agreement, we want to make changes in some other places around representation. So I do think that we could see changes that are potentially even outside of some of the realtor changes. Does that help? Is that what you needed?
Yeah, I think that's really helpful, Corinne.
Okay.
And so, John, I think some folks are still struggling with the idea of, could the seller still pay the buyer's commission? And what does this mean? Like, will a seller likely not want to offer that? Can they still offer that? How's that going to work?
Tina, it's a valid question. The only thing that the settlement talks about is that we can't put compensation in the multiple listing. Remember, the multiple listing is only for those that use that and are members, as Corinne said earlier. So it's not that you can't, it's what is it that's going to be available. And so as a listing agent, because I took that listing just not barely 2 weeks ago, I had that conversation with the seller about how did we want to start to pursue a buyer for this piece of property. And so knowing that the seller's willing, all right, to offer compensation, but let's say the seller's not, then that's where it's going to have to come on the buyer's agent to say. And when we think of compensation coming into a buyer, the seller may always want to. I don't know. We don't know what that seller is going to say when they take that listing. So if not, then the buyer's agent's going to have to do negotiation with their buyer. It's going to turn to the buyer.
Yeah.
It's
And
just
I
like,
think,
I'm sorry, Tina, if I might. Here's another example. What if Tina, you are for sale by owner and you said you were never going to offer compensation, and I'm a buyer's agent. I go to a for sale by owner, and the first things they say to me, because I've shown for sale by owners as a buyer's agent, they said, no, we're not offering compensation. Okay. When we did the contract, I asked them again and end up getting the seller to pay compensation, even though that they said they didn't want to at first. So even like for sale by owners, it might end up in that kind of a conversation. So then the skills that we have to have as a buyer's agent, you're going to have to be thinking, how do I want to be compensated for my services? Is it coming from the buyer? Is it going to come from the seller? And how is that, so the settlement's it's going to take one part of our commission away, because the language won't be there. Doesn't mean it's not going to happen. It just means it's not going to be in the multiple listing. That's the only thing that it's saying to us.
and I think that's an important call out, John. I'm glad you said that, because a lot of the questions are around, does a buyer agent get this? Does a seller agent get this? Does the buyer pay? Does the seller pay? So I think the moral of that story then, John, if you were to just kind of come full circle, is always get it in writing and it's negotiable. Can you talk a little bit more? Like, that's at the end of the day, is that what it means?
I think it is, Tina. I think it will come to that point. It's going to cause us to have a little bit more conversation as a buyer's agent and as a seller's agent taking listings, and also about how I work with my buyers in the future. I've always had, I lost a commission because I was out of town one weekend and let the buyer go look at it, and the listing agent was out on property, and the buyer bought that property. And, oh, by the way, and I lost the listing because of that, because that agent took the listing for their house so they could buy the other house. And I didn't have a buyer broker's agreement signed. And if I had, guess what I would have saved? At least the buyer's side, and maybe not the listing. So, I mean, I learned a number of years ago out of the School of Hard Knocks, I lost a commission on a buyer because I didn't have a buyer broker agreement signed. Now I don't work a buyer without it. I'm sorry, I'm worth too much to go out there, and it's like trying to say, well, am I going to get one or am I not? And I'm sorry, that's the conversation I have right up front now with buyers on a buyer broker agreement. And that's what we teach in the ABR program from National Association of Realtors. Have it up front.
That's great. So one of the other questions we see here, maybe Corinne, I'll pass this to you, and then John, you can chime in. Can the seller offer a percentage and the buyer also offer a percentage to that same broker? Can they be paid by both sources? And there's a little bit to untangle, I think, in that question. But Corinne, can you talk to that a little bit?
Sure, but I think that the answer is really going to be go back to your state's regulations, because across the country, some states have very specific rules around what type of disclosure you would have to have with your buyer and seller, with principal and customer in terms of compensation. And I really think that that is the key, is staying focused on what is required in my state and what do my agency agreements say with my clients. So is it possible that that could happen, that you would get compensation from both parties? Possibly, but not without a lot of conversation and a lot of disclosure around that. So I don't think that there is just a yes or no answer. I think it depends on your state regulations. It depends on your agency agreements. It depends on what conversations that you've had. And really, this, with this particular settlement proposal, and this was in response to one set of lawsuits around really transparency with conversations around commissions. I mean, the moral of the story is there's going to be a lot more communication. And to me, I think it's all going to start with communication with the buyer and what the expectation is. I hope that's helpful, because I do see the questions in the chat that are, can I get paid this? Can I get paid that? And you know, that it's just a much longer answer than yes or no.
And Corinne, I want to add one more to that, because the broker that's in charge may have a policy that says, no, I don't want that to happen. And they have every right to say that. And that's where I think that the broker in charge, principal broker, designated broker, each state's, you know, named a little bit different, that person has a lot of say also how this is going to be handled, and the documentation that they're going to want and the training that they're going to put out once we do know what the court's going to say when they ratify this, if they do, and the Department of Justice. I think it's important that we go back to our broker that we hang our license with or that we go to work for, because they may have policies too.
Yeah, for sure. So there's some questions coming through regarding VA buyers, what this will mean for those buyers' agents, and those buyers. John, can you talk to that?
Yeah, and you know, Tina, it is a valid question, and I've been hearing that one also. And as a matter of fact, I know the broker where my license is held currently, have I been having these conversations with the VA, just because it does state in their policy. Now, remember, that's a government agency, and policies can change there too if it's going to pose some issues. So I think, you know, who knows, we might see a change by the VA in that regard. Or, you know, you talk that compensation in a different fashion. We don't know yet. But the VA does state that the buyer doesn't. And so that's going to be, and I know, hey, everybody, I'm a veteran. I've used my VA buying properties even before I became an agent. So knowing that's one of those things we really look at and want to pay close attention to the VA too right now with what could happen.
Yeah, for sure. So Corinne, anything that you wanted to add on VA?
No, I appreciate John's comments there.
Okay. And there are some questions around, what does an individual need to do to be educated with the National Association of Realtors? Is there a test? How do they become familiar with those requirements? Corinne, can you give us some insight on that?
Sure, and I'm not, I'll answer that question in a couple of ways. I'm not sure I'm going exactly in the direction that the question was asking. So if I don't have it right, just continue to post in the Q&A. So let's start with, how do I know what the requirements are of me as a Realtor member? And so once someone is licensed, if in fact you choose to become part of the Realtor organization, there, you know, every local or state association has a different sort of onboarding process. And part of that is a pretty detailed review of the Code of Ethics requirements. The Code of Ethics is unique to the National Association of Realtors. But I'm not saying that other organizations don't have ethics. What I mean is, in joining the Realtor Association, there is the Realtor Code of Ethics to which all members have to adhere. So as part of the onboarding process, you're learning about your responsibilities as a Realtor member. So that's one side of what you might have been asking. The other side, how do I find out more information about everything that's happening? The National Association Realtors website is realtor.org, REALTOR.org. And you can go to that website and tune into all of their latest news. Also, there is a website, if you just type into your browser, competition.realtor, those are the pages that are really focused on what's happening in terms of the settlement proposal and other lawsuits. There are multiple postings there from NAR about where things stand. So that would be the place to really stay up to date and on this particular settlement proposal and other lawsuits and other action that may crop up. So competition.realtor is really a great education site. Do you think that's where that question was going, Tina, or did I miss the mark?
No, that's how I took it. And like I said,
Okay.
we're watching the Q&A to see if that addresses the question. But yeah, like you have to go, you get a license, you have to take a state exam, there's all this education, then they become an NAR member. How do they ensure they've learned about how to follow state law, but we haven't learned about NAR. And so I think that was a really good question, especially for individuals as they're entering this career. So Corinne, while you're talking about it, how can our attendees stay informed on new developments? I just wanted to make sure, can you talk a little bit more about that and what we're doing at Colibri?
Sure. And I'm just going to, in the chat for everyone, again, post what I said, which is competition.realtor. If you type that in your browser address bar, then it will come to the appropriate NAR page. That is a key place. But we're also going to be monitoring that on your behalf. This is not the first of the webinars that we have provided on this topic. In fact, this is the third, and we will have additional webinars. We will be posting the webinars themselves after the fact, and we will be posting updates as we find them out from the National Association of Realtors and from these lawsuits. So yes, realtor.org is a great resource, but we are going to continue to be that resource for you also. Whether you are a student of Colibri Real Estate or Rockwell or Allied or Hogan or Key, we're going to be keeping you up to date through our websites.
Thank you, Corinne. So as we're winding down the last few minutes, we'll continue to go through some questions here. John, can you talk a little bit about how you think this is going to evolve long term, and if you think the role of a real estate professional goes away?
You know, Tina, I've given this a lot of thought because I came into the business just as buyer representation was coming in. And I didn't know any better because I hadn't sold prior to 1994. And so I didn't know. And there were requirements that came out that we had to do. So I just learned to do them. And I see that what's going to happen right now is the same kind of transition. Because remember that NAR is an association. It's not state laws. It's an association. We used MLS heavily. And if this settlement goes through, as everybody is speculating, that language won't be there. So, you know, we found a way to talk buyer's agency. And I think what's going to happen is we will also resolve how we talk compensation. It's already, I'm seeing brokers creating conversations, pieces, documents that the brokerage is creating. Of course, you know, there are some states the attorney has to be involved. And so some of the brokerages have hired attorneys to help us create this language, because there's been a bunch of questions about that verbal. And of course, we all know that we don't do verbal things. And so I see extra steps as a buyer's agent that we kind of do, we kind of don't right now in some states. As we've alluded to, there are some states that do. But I think that it's going to sharpen the skills of agents all across the board, whether it's listing, buyers, property management, commercial. Commercial, they don't usually put anything in a multiple listing. And you still negotiate your compensation, and they've been doing it for a lot of years. And so it's just on the residential side that we see this. So it's changing the way we have to communicate. That's what I see taking place. It's going to be a change. And is it going to be, you know, a little at first? Well, we're already seeing some brokerages make those changes, and they're training their agents to, here's what we want you to do. So they're trying to be proactive with it. And I think that's been the important part, is being proactive about We don't know what's going to happen, but you know what? Maybe it sounds like a good idea. We put in some of these agreements and clean it up a little bit more so than what we have had, because those have been, as a broker, gosh, we were seeing 8,000 transactions a year. And you talk about problems with compensation, we had them. And this might help rectify some of the things that we see coming up, as a broker, that you're trying to, like, okay, how am I going to fix this? And this might just be a way for us to clean that too. That's what I see happening.
Thank you, John. I think that's good news for those individuals looking to enter this exciting field of real estate,
Yeah.
helping individuals realize the American dream. There's still a need for buyer's agents and seller's agents. Buyers and sellers still need representation, but it's an exciting time to enter and be part of these changes as we build and modernize the approach to real estate. And it's like you said, it's really cleaning it up. It's not significant changes, but it's a pretty exciting time.
It is. And, because of COVID, we've had changes, and we had to make changes because you couldn't put a buyer in your car anymore. And now a lot of real estate agents don't want buyers in their car. And so, we've made these changes, and we'll adjust. We'll adjust. It's there. I mean, it's going to take a little time to figure this all out, but it's going to cause us to sharpen our skills. It's going to tweak them, just like I had to sharpen my buyer agency skills when I first came in the business.
Yeah, for sure. And I think what most people, real estate professionals, in my experience over the last 30 years, they have big hearts, and they won't really truly want to help. And, so the question keeps coming up: how will, for example, a young couple, a first-time home buyer with limited funds, who are trying to realize the American dream, be able to afford to put down their first down payment and pay the compensation or commission to a buyer's representative? Thoughts on that, John? And then I'll turn it to Corinne, because I'd like her.
It is. And it's ironic, Tina, as you were saying that, I was looking at that question that came in on that one, and I've seen a couple others similar to that. It will cause us to have to get creative to figure out how we can help that first time buyer, or the young couple, or just a young person involved. I mean, it's always been an issue.
Yeah.
About, having a buyer that barely can qualify, and at the pricing, that's when I say sharpening skills. That's going to be an important negotiation skill we're going to have to really sharpen. We're going to have to look at that skill a little bit more. Sounds like a good training class.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think there's opportunity for all of us there. Corinne, any further thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think, yeah, that word opportunity, it's just like a neon sign for me, because I think this means opportunity in, how we're assisting and representing the buyers. I think compensation models, I think concessions, all of these conversations are going to start coming up. But the other neon flashing sign for me is the value proposition. And I'm sure that everyone can tell, I am very pro licensee, real estate agent, real estate broker. And I think there's so much value in assisting, particularly who you're talking about right now, a buyer who's buying their first home, navigating this process, really needing an expert to walk them through that. And how we navigate representing them, and what compensation looks like, that's just a piece of a bigger puzzle. Thinking about your value proposition is so important right now, and it's shifting. And the other thing is, I don't, I think sometimes we may be making this idea that, well, that once this settlement proposal, if it is approved, then everything's done and it changes. I really believe we're seeing quite a number of changes in the industry right now. So staying abreast of what's changing and what the implications are will be important. So opportunity, I guess that was the one word summary.
I agree. I agree.
Mhm.
It's gonna cause it. I know that there was a couple other questions and then there was a comment about, well, John, they said that you were talking to call up verbally. That's to ask a question. That's not to get it in writing. That's just to ask if it is being compensated. And so that's when we follow up with writing afterwards. And that's going to be up to the brokerages to, if we don't get any forms, well, we not had forms in the past, which then we got forms. But right now, I haven't seen anything that would cause that unless the brokerage has it. But yes, you would have to do all that in writing. You have to do it on writing, but you got to find out if they're offering it first.
And there's, as you are not going to be surprised to hear, there's a lot of question and concern about me as a real estate professional. Will my compensation drop? Will I have less opportunities? Will this result in more competition? Will, I have lower commissions? Um, and I think this is more about how we work with buyers and sellers and negotiate and get contracts, and less so about a true decrease in any way, shape, or form. As new individuals are entering this career, things that they should consider as they're thinking about their compensation going forward, and does this really change anything for them? So, Corinne, do you have any comments on that?
I don't believe that that is by any means a foregone conclusion. It certainly isn't. I think that there could we see some changes? Absolutely, we are seeing them. Does it mean a reduction? Not necessarily. It's really just exactly what Tina is saying, that going to be about redefining and having the conversation and communication with our clients in a different way. But that doesn't necessarily mean that things may be different. I mean, I think, as I said earlier, could there be different models out there and different conversations happening? Sure, I think that's a real possibility. But I don't believe that right now, to Tina's point, that the focus is on, is income going away. I think it's a little bit more about how am I redefining my relationship with my clients.
Yeah.
So I agree
Mhm.
with you, Corinne. I do think so.
That's great. So, John, any final thoughts as we kind of wind this down for today, and more to come in the future? Any final thoughts for these individuals who've taken the time to join us today on what they should particularly pay attention to going forward?
I think that it really is we'll have to watch it to see if anything changes as the court looks to ratify this in the Department of Justice, to be able to see the changes and also just to watch the states. So I think that the word that Corinne brought up earlier of opportunity, it's creating opportunities just in a different fashion. And I think that I don't see real estate going away, but that's my opinion. That's my opinion. That's not anybody else's. That's my opinion. I'm still going to be licensed and I'm still going to be out there working buyers and sellers. And so I think that we have opportunities ahead of us, just like we have had, just like we have had.
That's
And I
great, John.
just stay educated on them.
That's right. That's right. Corinne, any final thoughts as we finish up here?
No, I just want to, for anyone who's out there listening right now or watching the recording, thank you for your interest in this topic. Stay in tune. We will do our best to keep you up to date as changes happen, because they are happening. And what we need to do is keep talking about them. So thanks for your interest.
Thank you. And we are having several individuals asking if a recording will go out. It will be going out to anyone who registered for today's session. Give us a day or two to make sure we get it together, but we'll get that shared. But we are at time, and I want to thank both of you for your insights, for spending the time with us, and to all of our attendees for being passionate enough about the industry to cut out an hour and join us today. I hope you continue to do so as things progress. I imagine you love the industry as much as we do, and I'm excited that we're all coming together to build the future. As Corinne mentioned, we'll continue to keep you updated through several avenues. We thank you for being a part of our day today and hopefully in the days ahead. So that's all we have. Everyone, have a great day, and thanks for being here.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks,
Thank you,
Tina.
everybody.
Thanks, John.
Great questions. Keep them coming.
Yeah. Thanks to both of you. Have a great
Thank you,
Monday
Tina
evening.
and Corinne.
Yeah. Bye, everyone.